Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Flood. I serve St. Francis College as the Vice President for Advancement. It's my pleasure, our pleasure, to welcome you to the Professor John J. McCabe Lecture Series, The Big Short, A Look Back in Today's Relevance. It is our honor and privilege to introduce Chairman Dennis Salomone, St. Francis College Class of 1975.
Thank you, Thomas. I have the pleasure to introduce the namesake of this wonderful lecture series. John McCabe has had a storied financial services career with its beginning on Remsen Street and traversing through the financial world through Wall Street, Washington, D.C., and beyond. John was a young analyst at Bankers Trust when I took his corporate finance course 47 years ago. John's subsequent achievements at Shea Assets Management and Sterling Manhattan were complemented by leadership positions in the professional industry associations and including advising 3 US presidents. The one extraordinary achievement not included in John's resume is one of the most important. Hundreds, if not thousands, of St. Francis College students, myself included, were inspired by Professor McCabe to enter the financial services sector, contributing to St. Francis being ranked as the 3rd best Northern college for social mobility in the 2021 US News and World Report. Ladies and gentlemen, I turn you over to the person affectionately known to many as Professor, to tonight's moderator as Uncle John, and to me as friend, John McCabe.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis. I think we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. And I'm so glad Dennis did the introduction, because having been at the college for over 50 years, you always remember your best students, your worst students, and your funniest students. And certainly Dennis was one of the best students, and his career achievements also show that. I have an interesting job tonight. I'm really the opening act. I have about 5 or 6 minutes to frame the issue. And then I'll be introducing Eddie, and Eddie will be introducing the 2 panelists, and Vinny and Porter, and then they'll have a little conversation for about a half hour or so. Then we'll open it up to questions. So let's begin right away. And the essential purpose of a capitalistic society is to create wealth and capital. So each generation, hopefully, will have a higher standard of living. No other country does it better than ours, but we can't do it all of the time. The best time to do it is when inflation is under control. The worst time to try and do it is when you have deflation. And we've been very fortunate because the back of inflation was broken 38 years ago. And the median age of a US American citizen is 38. So half of our population has never really seen inflation. The worst problem we had was the 1929 up till probably 1960, if we didn't have World War II and we didn't have the Korean War. Deflation is a terrible thing. It's very hard to get at. Deflation really occurs when your financial assets and your hard assets like real estate implode. And that's what happened in our country. And people forget it because very few people from the greatest generation are really around today. Think about the people in the greatest generation. I mean, they went through depression, they went through World War II, and then they came back and helped build this country. The halcyon period really for the middle class growth was roughly from 1945 all the way up until the early 1960s. When we had President Johnson had the Great Society program, Guns and Butter, inflation started to come in, and that was really a problem. Major reason for the problem was that savers got hurt. We had a decline in purchasing power. It was really a difficult time. Ironically, if you go back and you look at the 2 main assets for wealth creation in our country, it's really common stocks and real estate. Common stock has done better than real estate over time. But from 1963 to 1981, the average annual return in the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 1.8%, less than inflation. So the goal is to create wealth and capital. We're good at it. Nobody's better than at it, but it's a difficult thing to do when you have inflation, and you can't do it when you have deflation. If you go back to the 1929 period, from high to low, common stock declined 90%. And from high to low, real estate values declined 90%. So 89% and 90%. And that's why Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected. He came in with the New Deal program. And then what he had to do is said, if you elect me president, I'm going to find somebody to head the Securities and Exchange Commission, because I'm going to set up the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it was very hard to find anybody to do it. He finally zeroed in on Joseph P. Kennedy, President Kennedy's father, because Joseph P. Kennedy loved to work on inside information. We had no SEC, and it's amazing that the corporate leadership could sell short, and we'll hear more about that when Ed comes on with the two panelists. So we really did need a Securities and Exchange Commission. That's what I'm trying to get to. Corporate governance was not what it is today, and individual investors, as we got up to the Kennedy era, individual investors they were basically 90% of the market. When Jack Kennedy became president, the average daily volume on the New York Stock Exchange was 4 million shares. Today, we don't blink when it's 4 billion shares. So the purpose of our society is to create wealth and capital. No country does it better than ours. It's so hard to believe that we are less than 5% of the world's population, and we're 24% of world GDP. If you look at the group of 7 nations, which includes the United States, the world's largest industrial democracies, that adds up to about 45% of world GDP. If you throw China on top of that, that's another 18 percentage points, and that gets us to 63% of world GDP. So what is that telling us? That's telling us there's 193 countries in the UN, and 8 economies account for 63% of world GDP. That's a plus and it's a minus. When we talk about the G7 nations, they have one thing in common, and that is they have negative population growth. You need 2.1% population growth just to break even. Not all women of childbearing age has children. Look at what's going on in Japan. That's the oldest nation. They have a median age somewhere in there about 45 or 46, but there's only 1.4 births per female of childbearing age. So if you look at the world around us, we have 330 million people here in the United States. There's 330 billion. There's 7 billion people in the world. So on the one hand, the United States, which is a consumer-driven nation, we take a look at the United States, we're a mature, cyclical, consumer-dominated country. About 70%, roughly 69, 70% of our GDP comes from you and I spending. If you and I don't open our wallets, if we go on strike, we're going to have a recession. And hopefully, if things get really bad, we could have another depression. We don't think that's happening right now. So you have to say to yourself, why is the United States such a world power? Well, we're gifted. We have land, labor, management. We've got technology, and we've got an enormous amount of financial capital. In addition to that, we have the world's strongest military. And I always like when I'm teaching to my students to tell them about Otto von Bismarck, who died around 1900, but he was the Iron Chancellor of Germany. And he was very envious and was very concerned about the United States because we were kind of on our own outside of his geographic area. And when he would talk about the United States, he would say, oh, the United States, they're emerging. I don't know how far they're going to get. I don't think he anticipated we'd become the world power. And what did he say? He said, they are the luckiest bunch of people you've ever going to see. They have friends to the north, friends to the south, and fish on the other two sides. So to a certain extent, our geographic location has been our friend. So we've got the resources. Okay, now if we can maintain a period of low inflation, we call it disinflation, maybe we continue on with growth. Before I pass it on to Ed, and they'll expand upon that, we're a consumer nation. We talked about that. We're a cyclical nation. We're talking about that. And what else do we know? I have something coming on in front of me later. I know if you people are seeing what I'm seeing. I can't see you anymore. So let me see if I can change this here. I don't know.
We see you, Uncle Joe.
Oh, yeah, now I can see people again. Okay. So we were talking somewhere about what were we talking about then? Okay, we were talking about what? Well, I guess we were talking about our country, why is it so great, et cetera, et cetera. But when I teach with my students, I always tell them, there's two types of people in this world. We got those that work for their money and those that have their money working for them. We want to have more people in the second category. So let me stop here, throw it on over to Eddie. And before he gets started, I have to tell you, we have to thank Eddie an awful lot because he was the one that came with the idea for this program. And as you probably know, he is a cousin of Jason McCabe Calacanis, who also did a program. But after Eddie saw the Jason program, he said to me, "Hey, Uncle John, I got tons of ideas, but I have a great idea for you." He said, why don't we do one on the Great Recession? I have two wonderful friends, Vinny and Porter, and they were portrayed in the movie, The Big Short. There's two of the brightest people you're ever going to meet. Eddie's been on Wall Street. They've all been security analysts, and the role of the security analyst really is that as a financial detective. They want to find companies that are undervalued, and maybe we can invest in those. They may want to find countries that are overvalued, and maybe we can sell those companies short and capitalize on the downward move. And on the other hand, maybe if the company is fully priced, we'll keep them under surveillance because they may do better or they may do worse. So when these folks zero in on their analysis, they look at the income statement, which is simply management's report card for 1 year. They look at the balance sheet, which is the financial muscle of a company. And they also look at cash flow, which is the blood and the oxygen of the company. And they want to know, did management deliver? So they could say, well, why don't we check on net profits? That'll be the numerator. We'll put common stockholders' equity or net worth on the denominator, and that will give us return on equity. Well, that's too easy. There's something else you got to look at. You got to look at what's the value of their total assets as a numerator and divide that by net worth or common stockholders' equity. So that was one of the biggest problems we had with the Great Short. So if we have a situation like McDonald's Corporation has a 7%, roughly a 7% return on assets. But if you look at the relationship between the value of their total assets on the balance sheet and you look at their common stockholders' equity, you find that they have a financial leverage ratio or an equity leverage ratio of 3. And that means for every dollar that the common stockholders put up, they borrowed or the creditors put up $2. 1 + 2 is 3. But if you take that equity leverage ratio of 3, multiply that by the return on assets of 7, total assets come out when you cross multiply, and you find out that McDonald's delivers about a 20 to 21% return on equity every year. And if you look at that and you divide it into the rule of 7.2, they basically double their return on equity every 4 or 5 years. The key question tonight is going to be leverage. So just getting back to the situation with leverage, we've had 12 recessions since World War II, not counting the one we had with COVID-19. Takes the National Bureau of Economic Research a while to determine when the recession started and when to it end. From what I'm hearing, we will probably get that by the third quarter. But if you look at the 12 recessions before that, we're very lucky in our country. And the reason why we're lucky is our recessions only run about 10 months. Our periods of prosperity run about 59 months. We also know that since we have all of these great resources, buying on bad news is probably a good thing because every bear market is surrounded by bull market. And every time we come out of a recession, both common stock and GDP normally go on to new levels. So it's somewhat counterintuitive. Fear is a good thing. Greed is a terrible thing, And now I've been talking too much. So let me tell you a little bit about Eddie and what he's doing, Eddie, he'll tell you about his background and he'll let us know about Porter and Vincent's as well. But Eddie, unfortunately, didn't have the benefit of going to St. Francis like his father and his 2 uncles and his 2 great uncles went here. His Uncle Gerald Kennedy passed away and his Uncle Joe DeFalco great uncles. They went to St. Francis, and so did my brother Tom and my brother Eddie. And I would say to you, there's no way Eddie would be as successful as he has been if his father didn't go to St. Francis, and certainly if his mother didn't go to St. Joseph's College for Women, which is now St. Joseph's. I can tell you, I wouldn't be sitting where I'm sitting today if I didn't go to St. Francis College, okay? And certainly I wouldn't be sitting here today if my wife didn't go to St. Joseph's College for Women, okay? So Eddie, let me just throw it over to you, and you can take it from there. Thank you, Ed.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'd just like to echo on that point Uncle John just made. I'm very cognizant of how important colleges, particularly St. Francis, is. It's a transformational college for families. You know, it's a place where when my dad and my uncles went there, they were first generation college students, and I'd imagine now it's still first generation college students, but it's also first generation Americans. So I was very happy to help when Uncle John asked, and it's an important college for the McCabe family. It was a transformational college for the extended family. So thanks for having me. So, you know, McCabe's are really good at many things, but we're really good at two things: nepotism and having hooks, because we're a big family. So we have a guy who can get you out of central booking, and we have a guy who can get you an audience at the White House. So in this case, because I had a hook into two very good guests, and then playing on the nepotism expertise, I am now your moderator. I'm not sure that's based on any type of pedigree, but I'm your man. But it's going to be pretty easy because I have two great guests, and basically I throw the ball near the rim for these guys and they dunk it. So it's something I'm looking forward to doing. Two great guys, two good friends, and let me introduce them. Porter Collins and Vincent Daniel. Vinny, I worked with at Oppenheimer. I think I started in Oppenheimer in '96, and Vinny joined maybe 6 months later. Porter, I met through Vinny years later, but they worked together. And I'd assume you watched the movie if you're watching this, because you didn't come to see me. So these guys were on the team that's featured in The Big Short. So when I asked them if they would do it, they jumped at the chance, and I was really appreciative of that. So let me introduce them. I'll start with Porter. I'm just going to go do a little background. Well, by the way, the program here is going to be freewheeling. I have some themes I want to touch on. The Fed will be woven throughout it. But the worst thing I can do is stifle these two guys. So why don't we start with just an introduction? Porter, why don't you give us a little bit of your background? Where are you from? Where'd you go to high school? Where'd you go to college? That type of thing.
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you for having me here. I especially appreciative of Uncle John's history and economics lesson there. I feel like I was back in school, so I'm a bit smarter for all that. I appreciate the history tie-in as well. I was a history major in college. I grew up spent a little time in Europe, but I was born in New York City. And I went to a place called Salisbury School. I went on to Brown University. At Brown, I was a rower, and not many people probably know the sport, but I was particularly good at it. I won a couple of national championships at college, and then went on to, at the time, I was the youngest Olympian on the '96 Olympic team, and then I went on to the 2000 Olympic team. After that, I had a friend whose father was a short seller, and for better or for worse, I thought it was a fantastic profession, and so I really wanted to be a short seller. And so, I mean, the man is the quirkiest individual of all time, and so I thought it was a great idea. Wanted to go to a hedge fund, and got a job, and I worked for this guy Steve Eisman, and he pretty much taught me everything I know about the business. And then I met Vinny, and the rest is kind of history.
And Vinny, a little bit on your background?
Sure. Thanks, Ed. And I echo the sentiments. Thank you for doing this. This is fantastic, and really look forward to the Q&A and discussion and the dialogue. I grew up, I'm a Queens kid. I'm a borough kid through and through. I went to school at Archbishop Malloy High School, which probably some of the alumni know pretty well. Did my 4 years there. And after that, I decided to stay in New York and went to Binghamton University and majored in accounting. And the reason why I majored in accounting was because Binghamton specialized in their business school in accounting, and that was the way to get a job. And I was there pretty much to get a job. And thankfully, I met some of the greatest friends in my life there and learned how to socialize and communicate, which really helped. After that, I did a 2-year stint at Arthur Andersen, got my CPA, but I hated it. And I really did not want to be an accountant. And I always knew, or I felt when I was younger, and when you grow up in Queens, if you look to the West, you know that's where the money is. And my mother was an accounts payable clerk at a commodities brokerage firm. And I remember going to their company picnics. And I said, I want to do that, not knowing what that was. So eventually, after doing my 2 years, I spoke to my friend who was working at a firm called Oppenheimer, which Ed knows all too well, because we worked together. And I fought my way to get into the research department at Oppenheimer, covering financial services, and in particular, specialty finance companies and mortgage companies. The person who hired me was similar to the person who hired Porter, which was Steve Eisman. And then eventually, both of us went to Front Point Partners, where really the story of The Big Short really took place.
That's great. So you guys have almost identical backgrounds.
Exactly.
Queens, Binghamton, Brown, Olympic. Well, you broke in like 70 at Forest Park, so you're an athlete yourself.
Well, Ed, actually, the joke I was going to say is, while I'm not an Olympian, I did specialize in high school, and I played on the Malloy handball team. And if there's anyone who's a borough guy or woman, knows that handball is the sport of the boroughs. So,
Right.
And it's still alive and well. So.
Right.
The funniest part is that, aside from growing up, Vinny and I could be brothers. Like everything we think is the exact same way. The anger, the questioning, the love of history, the love of economics. It's amazing. We're probably, we're closer to brothers than friends.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Like, I think there's a stereotype of who's on Wall Street, and that hasn't been my experience. And it makes really interesting bedfellows, where guys from very different backgrounds come together and work and have common ground despite very different backgrounds. And there's a lot of kindred spirits. So it's actually more diverse probably than it was years ago when it was really a blue blood industry, but now it's a little more democratized or more of a meritocracy. So it's not uncommon. And by the way, your team at Front Point was probably a good example of that, right? I mean, it's as diverse as you can get, Old Testament represented, New Testament represented, but everybody intellectually curious, everybody with a healthy dose of skepticism, bordering on some cynicism at times. But, so I've seen that often in my career. So you guys both touched on kind of who got you into the business, and that common person is Steve Eisman. And Steve Eisman was played by, what's his name? Steve Carell, who I know Steve Eisman. Steve Eisman has the bedside manner of Dr. Frankenstein, but Steve Eisman is actually a very good guy. And he has a very, very big lineage of successful protege, maybe I wouldn't say, but he has mentored and brought a lot of people up in this business. Really, really bright guy. So I guess most people have seen the movie. They got a sense for Steve because Steve Carell played him so well. Can you talk about how instrumental a guy like Steve Eisman was in your career, what it was like to work with him and for him and that type of stuff? Either one of you can take that.
For me, I wouldn't have been on Wall Street if it wasn't for Steve. And he was the one that brought me in and believed in me. And he gave me enough rope to either hang myself or to succeed in a material way. I remember, and you'll remember this, Ed, as a young person being a sell-side analyst, the majority of analysts would never let their junior analysts out on the sales desk, out meeting clients, traveling with them, doing investment banking routines. Steve took me from day one,
right,
and thrusted me in there. And I had no choice but to either learn or not make it. And
right.
I thank Steve to this day for doing what he did in terms of getting me into the front door of Wall Street.
Yeah, I think you were like me. Every day I walked into Oppenheimer, I figured it was my last day. So I thought they're just going to fire me tomorrow anyway. But it was a great place to learn. Porter, you had a good anecdote for me about, when you first started working for Steve and how he trained you, so to speak. So why don't you touch on that a little bit?
I mean, I always say to young kids that, when you're looking at jobs and hopefully you have a, possibility to have multiple opportunities, you always got to take the one where someone's going to train you, because, if you sacrifice the short term, or go for short term opportunities and it just doesn't work. So if all my first jobs, I always said, just get me in the door. I'll work my way to the top. And, when I first got to work for Steve, he's like, Porter, you don't know anything. And so before I even started, he had his list of like 15 books that he made me read before I could even start working. And it went from, the Chosen to, a lot of all the Chaim Potok books, to the History of Sex, to like this whole gamut of stuff, to the stuff that influenced him that he liked. And he wanted me to think like him. He made me subscribe to the National Review. He had a lot of different stuff that he wanted me to open up my mind and really think critically. And so that was the big thing that he really wanted from us, is to think critically. And I think that's the gift that he gave to both Vincent and I. And one of the things he always taught us is, you go in to every management meeting and you assume they're lying to you, right? And you can walk your way back from that, like, oh, maybe he's not lying. And so if you go in with that reverse assumption, you think differently about things. And so I think, that's how we got to where we are. And, certainly if you hear some of our investment views and stuff, we don't think like normal people. We just think outside the box, and we like it that way.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So people want to know this. I'm kind of interested in this because I've never spoken to you guys a lot about it. What's it like? Well, first of all, since the movie is based on a book by Michael Lewis, who's a fantastic author, and that's a great book about that whole situation in you guys, what is that process like? Like, is Michael Lewis spending hours with you to understand things? Is it calls? Is it lunch? Is it multiple meetings over years? How does that work on the book side?
Well, I think one of the first things we should talk about is how the book came about, right?
Right.
And so keep in mind, Michael wrote Liar's Poker. And when he saw what was going on during the Great Recession, he started cold calling people that he knew. And the first person he called was someone that we work with, Ed and I work with very intimately, Meredith Whitney. And
Right.
And he called her and said, what's going on? And Meredith said, look, I can tell you, but if you want the experts, you need to call these guys at Front Point who are actually knee deep in this trade to begin with. So as we started to get to meet him, and correct me if I'm wrong, Porter, the first thing was an article in Vanity Fair.
Yep. 3-part series for Vanity Fair. And
then he turned that into a book. And I will tell you that the interviewing, I mean, just shows you how great Michael Lewis is. If he ever interviewed you for a book or for anything, the piercing of what I'll remember is how detailed he was, and the piercing of his eyes as you were speaking. You knew he was listening intently, trying to understand, and actually trying to get the essence and the character of you and exactly what you were saying. It was almost intimidating, but you could just tell. You walked away saying, wow, this is the reason why I love his books and why he's so good at this.
Right.
Look how he's interviewing us. It was incredible, an incredible experience.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. And then
it was also nerve-wracking at the time too. You're being interviewed by Michael Lewis, and you've seen his books. They're not puff pieces, right?
No.
And so and me and I had read, when we heard he was going to come interview us, we obviously quickly read all his books, and they're not puff pieces, and so we were a bit nervous to give our entire story to the world. We didn't in our wildest dreams think it'd become a movie. I mean, I think my quote, or maybe Vincent's quote, was like, it's gonna be a horrible movie. And it ended up being a fantastic movie. But, it was nerve-wracking. Not only was your life going to be on display, but it was at a time where, the world was in the dumps and we were making money, and so we had a good time doing what we did in our office, and we're, certainly the loudest bunch of people on Wall Street. But, outside of that, you couldn't go out and celebrate and stuff like that, nor did you want to really. And so it was kind of an odd time.
Did all of you guys who were on the team agree to work with Michael Lewis on that book, or were there guys who said, I really don't want that exposure, or I don't want the risk of him knowing my intimate thoughts, or was it a no-brainer to do it, I guess is the question.
You want to take that, Porter?
I was more skeptical than the rest of the team. I was more nervous about it. I mean, Vinny's an easy superhero, a kid from Queens. No one wants to hear about a waspy kid who rode, whose big sport was rowing. That's not exciting, right? So,
but Ed, there were guys on the team that did not want to be a part of it, and so they weren't mentioned or referenced, or less mentioned and referenced in the book and the movie than
right.
in terms of the role that they played. So
right. Okay. And then moving to the movie, like what is that like? Like what is the process? Like, okay, now you're featured in the movie. Is the actor in regular touch with you to get to know your personality? Does he get to know where you are from and what makes you tick? Like, how do they go? What is that process?
First off, it depends, right? It depends on the actor and how serious they took their role and didn't take their role. I was blessed to be played by Jeremy Strong, and he took the role extremely seriously, to the point where he would call us up, or call me up at about 9 or 10 o'clock at night and text me and say, hey, I have a shoot tomorrow. Here's the scene. This is how they want to portray you. That's not who you are. I don't think who you are. Let's go through this. So I'll give you an example where if you remember, Porter, the heated argument that we had with Deutsche Bank over the prices of the bonds and the like. And he said to me, he goes, they actually want you to say, I'm going to pull out my gun and shoot you. You would never say that. And I said, no, I wouldn't ever. And please don't say it. He goes, well, what would you say? I go, well, I would intellectually berate them in a nice, try to calm manner. He goes, well, explain. And so I went through it, how I would do it. And, when I saw the product that Jeremy put out of me, I was just so proud of what he did. It was great. So.
You give Michael Lewis the story. And then when it comes to the movie, you got to give, the writer, who was Adam McCabe, but, Adam was known to be a, SNL writer. And so
right.
It's hard to get, a true flavor of what he was going to say, because once you sign your name away, he can kind of do anything to your character. And if you've watched the movie recently, that our other partner, Danny, we're watching the screening, and they said, meet Danny Moses, and it pops up the big diagram on the movie, shows his testicle. He goes, Danny's got a big testicle. And Danny's like, no, that I don't have that.
That's a lot of license.
And so, they can do anything to, and so, McCabe McKay had to sell tickets, right? And so, I think that the book was super accurate. The movie was accurate, for the most part, but they did a good job of selling it to the masses, though.
They definitely took kind of a complicated, arcane topic and made it mainstream. And that was pretty brilliant that they were able to pull that off and make it still, kind of factually accurate, at least within reason.
Yeah.
Ed, one of the things that was, I just remembered, because we all knew that this is a once in a lifetime experience. We did not expect to be doing this every 2 years or so. So one of the first things they do is they give us all a wardrobe consultant, right? And so they want to know how we were dressed at the time. Now, the camaraderie, the one thing I'll say at Front Point, the camaraderie and the relationship at Front Point was almost like a locker room or a college dorm. And so, of course, this was grounds to just roast each other left and right in terms of what the other person was wearing. So, of course, you know, Porter and them, I used to wear a BlackBerry buckled at my belt, and Porter and Danny made sure of it, that thing was on the set and in the movie. And if you go back and watch Jeremy, he's wearing it. And I said, well, no, I really wasn't. And they go, oh, yes, you were. And so, of course, we went back and forth saying, well, I think Danny said, well, Porter always wears his shoes without socks, right? And Porter hates it.
That's the uniform.
And so, no, but he hated it. He hated it. So these little quirky things, we just tried to have fun of it because we knew this wasn't happening again.
That's funny. All right, and maybe we'll weave the film in again, but I actually really want to talk about, what was going on back then retrospectively. And then I want a lot of things, the reaction to what happened with the great financial crisis has had effects that linger to this day and has stoked where we are today. So I think there's a story to tell that starts from the great financial crisis, and we can talk right into the present day in the market environment we're in. And we'll talk about maybe how the Fed is very responsible for the social divides in this country. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here, but take me back. I don't need all the heavy details of how you expressed the short, but what did you see that caused you as a team? I know the movie says you got like a wrong number and some guy sold you, a credit default swap or something like that. Is that what happened? I can't believe that's what happened.
The funny thing is that, the world was obviously very different back then. And, I don't know if our today's self would have had as much, given what's happened with the Fed and, stocks have gone to the moon at this point. The mood was very different back then for us. And that, we were super skeptical on the housing market, and we sort of knew it was going to crash. We were just waiting for it. We had this thesis. If you go back, 2003, 4, 5, 6, we saw it, right? That's what we did, and that was our business. And we started seeing everyone flipping their homes, and we were short pretty much every stock related to housing, related to all the banks. We did get a call from a bond dealer who had this credit trade on. And so that's how we discovered the credit default swap business and short again. But from there, it took a life of its own. And we, there were a lot of people had it on, but no one really had it on the same way we did, in that we understood the plumbing of everything that went on so well, from the home to the Wall Street banks, to what it infected, right? It infected the entire financial system. It basically, that people don't realize, but the system was days, hours, weeks from failing, completely shutting all the banks down. And so, there's that scene in The Big Short where we're on St. Patrick's Cathedral steps. We really thought the system was going to fail. And so, it's just very interesting to see, and you can, I like to brag, we were the last ones that fought the Fed and won, because the Fed was really behind what was going on at the time, and the regulators. And, thankfully the Fed did catch up. And I one of the nicest things I'll ever say about the Fed, they did a good job of saving the world at the time,
Right.
at the bottom, and they just flooded it with liquidity.
So it wasn't really that there was a seminal moment where you're like, we got to short this now. You were building this position over years, it sounds like.
Life never works that way where you're like, you come to this epiphany that, it's all cumulative. I think, you have this thesis going in the back of your mind, and something might trigger it where, now's the time to go. And that's what it was. There was some, we, I don't think got lucky, but we timed it perfectly. We put the shorts on in August of '06 in the housing market, and that was the peak of home prices.
And one of the things we were doing at the time, even before we put on the trade, was we were short a lot of these mortgage names because we saw deterioration in underwriting standards in the underlying data that we were looking at, these securitization pools. So for us, what the Deutsche showed us, and eventually Goldman showed us, was a better way to express what we felt already.
Right.
With much more optionality to the upside. And we were paying less in terms of a cost to put this trade on than we were just shorting the stocks.
Right.
So we were, and this goes back to way back
Why don't you
when.
explain to what the cost to us was?
Well, the cost to us was, and think about it as an insurance, we were paying insurance on the notional value of what we were short, and it was about 2 to 3%. Whereas if we shorted one of the stocks that had a similar risk exposure, the cost was around 12 or 14% because they were paying a dividend. So
Right.
It's a much cheaper way to express the trade with more upside. That was the beauty of the short that we put on.
And the bonds weren't really going to go to 105, 110 on us, right? We were shorting them at par.
Right. Front Point was minority owned by Morgan Stanley, or was it a majority ownership from Morgan Stanley?
Initially, it was an independent company run by guys who used to work at Morgan Stanley. They eventually got acquired wholly by Morgan Stanley. I'm forgetting the exact year.
Right.
But it happened to be at the time this trade was going on that we were owned by Morgan Stanley.
So talk about the dynamic whereby you guys are short mortgages. Morgan Stanley, your parent, is loaded to the gills with the same mortgage product. Steve Eisman is not only very short, but very vocal about it. So he's basically crapping all over Morgan Stanley's balance sheet. And I guess in the movie, they show some of that tension. Was that tension real? Like, were those meetings happening? Like, and what was that all about? How was that? What was that about?
Well, we try to fancy ourselves sometimes as renegades, particularly that we take after Steve in many respects. So the mere fact that we, just to use a card analogy, felt like we had the nut flush in our parent company was deep in this. As you can imagine, that intrigued Steve, and Steve loved to go to Broadway, to the C-suite at Morgan Stanley, and basically tell these guys and the women they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
So
he loves a lecture like that.
And Porter and myself sat in meetings with Morgan Stanley management where Steve is just intelligently ridiculing their exposures.
Right.
And I will tell you, the aha moment for us, I'll speak for myself, where we knew this was really, really, really bad, was when we figured out that as a hedge fund, you keep your certain amount of cash in liquid instruments. And at Morgan Stanley, they kept it and called this enhanced money market fund. So we spoke to, I forget who it was, Porter, the treasurer, and said, well, we want to see what you're invested in. It's not cash, it's in something else. And lo and behold, it was in the bonds that we were short. So they owned stuff in what is supposed to be cash that we felt was worth 50 cents on the dollar. And we weren't the only ones. And the entire US system was in these bonds more so than anyone thought. I remember walking away from that meeting doing the holy crap moment and saying, oh my, the whole thing can come down.
No one would really think, and then it goes to AIG, and they held the CDS, and it was everywhere, and that was where we really nailed it. We figured out that it was everywhere, and no one else. People just short of the bonds. We sort of figured out it was everywhere, and that's when we were really scared the system was going to collapse, and it was close.
And it certainly was. And you talked about owning the CDS is like owning an insurance contract. And the only way insurance works is if you get paid when you have a claim. And if the system's about to fail, what was the calculus on your side saying, okay, we're right, but are we getting paid on being right? Like, or is my counterparty going to fail? Was that something you talked about regularly? Was that a real risk you talked about?
Well, the time, it's odd because, you know, the system didn't, the bonds really collapsed in 2007.
Mhm.
The system really broke down much later. And so, you know, we had cleared out of our, you know, the bonds essentially went to zero, or the, you know, the triple B bonds went to zero or close to it in the end of 2007, beginning of 2008. Whereas, you know, the I think the S&P and the, the bank index still was at its highs in that time. And so it was this odd sort of time, really
Right.
was.
And during most of that trade, the Fed was tightening, right?
No, what I think aided our trade was particularly in 2007. And if you go back, and I think we went back the other day and looked, take a look at what the price of oil did in 2007. It
Right.
kept increasing. So in many respects, what we felt like we knew at the time wasn't being reflected in any other asset class in the world. And so as oil was going up, even if the Fed chairman at the time, Bernanke, felt like he wanted to cut, he was going to have a very difficult time explaining cutting when oil went from,
Right.
I believe, $85 a barrel to $140 a barrel, which in an odd way helped our trade because he was on the sidelines before he could cut rates. And quite frankly, and I think this has been written by many, he was, and I think Porter said it, he really, and they really did not have a clue as to how the plumbing of the non-bank financial system worked. And it was only until after the Great Recession that they had a true understanding of the money flows that was going on.
One of the Fed's biggest failures, and it's one of its biggest achievements before, is that they didn't regulate these banks at all. They let them do whatever they want, and you saw the capital ratios just go down and down and down. And post crisis, they've really done a nice job of, the banks are very, very safe these days. And during COVID, like they weren't, the banks have never been more flush with cash and capital, even even at the depths of COVID. So no one was ever really worried about the banking system. The scary times in the U.S. are during banking crisis, right? In 2008 and in the 30s. And that's what really devastates. It's hard. You can't come back from that, right?
Right. So rates got cut after the crisis, but rates have, you would have thought, this many years later, whatever it is, 13 years later, that there'd be some normalization from the Federal Reserve and other investment central banks. What are your thoughts on why we need interest rates this low? Like, why?
I think it's quite simply the fact that the way they got out of the Great Recession was to nationalize a lot of the risk and put it on the US government balance sheet. And then they decided, in many respects, to say, well, rather than issue that debt or issue the debt, why don't we purchase it ourselves? And they came up with a fancy name for it called quantitative easing. There's some nuances to that, but that's what it is. And in doing so, all we have done is increase our debt burdens, not just us, but globally as a society. And at least the way I think about it, I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong, is that we actually solve for survival now. And what I mean by that is we have so much debt. If anyone does a sensitivity analysis, that if we go to a 4 or 5 or normalized interest rate of 4 or 5%, the world doesn't work. It can't work. Asset prices are too high. They will come down. We can't service our debt as governments. So the only way this world is going to work is if we keep rates extremely low. And sadly, the more debt we add, the lower rates need to go for us to break even and grow. This is the reason why I don't think we can normalize rates.
I mean, just look what happened today. We're exiting COVID very quickly. The job growth is accelerating. GDP is going to be fantastic this year and probably next year. Inflation is about to be above their 2% target, And the Fed came out today and they said, we're not even thinking about raising rates. And so they have all this quantitative easing. They have all the fiscal, checks to the population coming out, and you have all the stimulus pumped into the system. Can you imagine what it's going to be like when they pull the handbrake on some of this stuff? It's going to be you're just setting yourself up for another collapse at some point. It's just a question of when. And our biggest issue is just too much debt.
And Porter, you touched on inflation, and we know how the government measures inflation, but do you think that there is low inflation, or do you think that inflation is just mismeasured? Because when I look around my life, there's very few things that don't feel like they're inflating. From my healthcare to housing to used car prices. If you got a kid in college, yeah, maybe my refrigerator hasn't gone up in price a lot, but just the things you touch and feel every day, it doesn't feel like we're in 2% inflationary environment. So what do you, and does inflation eventually have to happen given how easy the Fed has been for so long?
Well, I think, I think your Uncle John would probably, if he looked at the inflation and the way the Fed calculates it, it's just a lot different than it was in the 70s. And the Social Security payments and a lot of government payments are based on an index to inflation, and so they're incented to keep inflation super low. And so, yeah, look at everything we have; it's inflating like crazy at this point. But it's not going to show up in the official statistics. And so, when you talk about the current environment, one of my favorite trades is we have the inflation trade on. We've had it since June of last year, and we're super long at everything inflationary at this point. And fixed costs and the revenues are allowed to float with inflation, whether it's oil companies, whether it's copper companies, whether it's shipping companies. So we love this trade because we saw it coming, we see it coming, and it's not going to stop for a while. And when it does, we'll turn around and short it.
Right. Why don't I take a break here, because there's a question from the audience. Mike McIntyre has a question. Hopefully this Zoom thing works and I get a question.
You messed it up, Ed.
Oh, this is bound to happen. Well, Kristen Anderson, when you know how to get him on, please let me know, or if he's going to text me his question. I'll take it that way too. So
There he is.
He's on right now.
Hey, Michael, how are you?
Go on. Sorry, we can keep going.
Okay. Well, when we get him squared away, we'll take him. So we've got crazy quantitative easing. We have low rates.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Sure. Go ahead, Michael.
All right, good to see you, and thanks for doing this. So I'm an adjunct professor by night and a full-time banker by day. And in my finance course that I teach with your uncle, I use Hank Paulson's book On the Brink to kind of give folks the example of how crazy things got in 2008. You mentioned that banks are a bit better off now from a liquidity perspective. Can you explain how banks like CS and Morgan Stanley just missed it on Wang and Archegos and their whole trading platform?
I have a cynical take.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
So if you think about hedge funds like Archegos or even some of the larger hedge funds, in general, they are the biggest revenue producers for places like Credit Suisse.
Yeah, commissions. Yeah.
Morgan Stanley, Nomura, commissions. It just so happens that they are also covered by the salespeople who make the most money in the bank. And those people tend to move up in the C-suite. They want to keep the party going. So as a result, my opinion is the risk manager gets pushed aside for the most part in favor of the revenues and the people that make the party going. I believe that's probably one of the biggest reasons why firms, and this is where in times like this, you see firms like Credit Suisse, not to pick on them, have a really, really bad hit. And this is the second time around where I saw Goldman Sachs come out of it pretty much squeaky clean. And that's mainly because I think when the crap hits the fan, the risk manager, correct me if I'm wrong, Porter, who's a Navy SEAL, right, come and says, this is what we're doing. And when the, I'll say it, she country club, you know, 7-figure salary people balk against him, he probably physically intimidates them. And Goldman listens to the risk manager, not to the revenue generator. And this is the reason why they get out of their issues. And Credit Suisse has a huge hole on their balance sheet.
Well, Goldman won last, during the subprime crisis. They were long all this stuff. When they figured out there was a problem, they quickly got short. And when they finally got short, they let the prices collapse. And the risk man, the Navy SEAL at Goldman Sachs, plays by different rules than the country club guy at Credit Suisse, right? Who's incentivized for revenue growth rather than protecting the bank. It's sort of that simple. It always is that simple.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Guys, I want to pivot to a topic because we chatted recently, and I know it's a topic that you guys think a lot about, and it's the wealth divide in this country. My Uncle John talked about, how the wealth is concentrated worldwide in a handful of G7 economies. But that really goes on here in the United States. And there's been a widening gap between haves and have-nots for many, many years. And actually, it's now accelerated during COVID. So during COVID, an awful time was more awful, like most things are, if it's less awful for the wealthy people and more awful for the people who don't have wealth. But now we've exacerbated the gap. If you're a white-collar worker and you own a house in suburban New York or in Florida, you probably kept your job, your house probably went up in value, stocks have skyrocketed. And if you're the other guy, on an absolute and relative basis, the gap has widened. So when I look at, on the one hand, the government reacting to all types of pressure to try to address this issue, and it's a very important issue to be addressed, I'm watching the Fed really stoke it. And does this divide, in your opinion, just continue to widen as long as the Fed's going to be easy? Or is it not Fed related in your mind?
It's a tough one. Vinny and I have a bunch of friends. Your Uncle John was talking about that. That he was scared it doesn't end in revolution. We have a bunch of people who think the revolution's coming. They want us to read the French Revolution books, but it's concerning, right? It really is, in terms of that divide between rich and poor, and I think it's not just one policy, it's years and years of policy, and they tax capital at lower tax rates than they do labor. One of the biggest things that we keep on railing on is that they call it lobbying, but they're bribes, and Washington's bought and paid for at this point, and our leaders fail us, right? You go down the list, and I'm not going to get into a political discussion, but a lot of our leaders have failed us along the way, and to keep their jobs, and they take money and they look the other way. And so, do I know how to fix it? I'm like everybody. I know the Fed's trying to fix it, but I don't think they're fixing it at this point.
And I think one of the most important things we have to watch over the next 2 or 3 years is the fight of wages and where they go for this country. In my opinion, they have to go higher. If not, I think your Uncle John's going to be right in terms of social unrest. And I think the Fed plays a major, major part in it. Actually, in a way, they don't play a major part in it, even though they're trying to lower rates to get wages up. I think it's that aspect of inflation, wages, is the thing they control the least, right? Automation and offshoring jobs is far more important than lowering rates. And what we've seen in the past is every time labor starts to get a leg up and wages go up, capital markets go down, and the Fed blinks, they choose capital over labor.
Right.
They're promising going forward that's not going to be the case. We'll see. Because every time the market gets jittery, they blink. We'll see if they blink the next time inflation potentially does rear its ugly head. We'll see.
Just think about this COVID crisis. I know it was a big deal, but we had these huge transfer payments the government put on something like, I get the numbers wrong, 10 trillion of debt over the past year. And what do we have?
Right.
Nothing. Just more
Right.
debt. We didn't build any roads. We didn't build any factories. We didn't do anything.
Right.
And so I think that's the most frustrating part, is that, you sort of see it slip away a bit. And, we call it like we see it. We don't try to, it's just, it is
Yeah.
what it is.
Shifting gears a little bit, with the Fed this easy for this long, there must be bubbles everywhere, or one major bubble. I mean, whether it's Bitcoin or Dogecoin or GameStop or SPACs, or the most valuable companies in the world are structurally unprofitable, will never make a dime, but have 60, billion-dollar market caps. Do you guys see a specific bubble that concerns you? And are you investing accordingly?
Vinny and I were chatting yesterday about this, and Vinny, why don't you tell them the story about, we had one of our biggest investors was a pension plan in Sweden, and they have a system where there's like 7 of these blocks, and one of them was invested with us, and you can tell the story, Vin.
So we're sitting in this meeting somewhere in Sweden after going out for a great dinner, and we have this gorgeous presentation.
All fish though, it's like cod and
Yeah,
fish.
but we were looking to keep our money, so we ate it. It was not a big deal. And so we're in the meeting and we're providing a presentation, and Porter, I guess, boldly says to a group of 40 people, show of hands, who in the world is investing in negative yielding debt right now? And about 60% of the hands went up.
Right.
And this is about 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
Paul and I and Danny are sitting there looking at each other, and we realized that was a learning experience, because that was the last thing we expected. We expected them to high five us for a question of that nature, that what was going on was crazy. So when you ask me the question, what's the bubble I worry about?
Yeah.
The lack of return that people are getting, providing debt capital to companies, governments, and the like. It's fixed income that scares me.
Right.
But I'm told I'm wrong, and I understand why. Is because every time it goes wrong, the Federal Reserve is going to bail that out, and they have.
Right.
And I retort to these guys, I'm like, but guys, how do you make money? You're buying a negative yielding bond. Like, well, we're hoping that goes more negative. I was like, this is crazy. And so the German Bund is still, they issue debt at negative 60 basis points. Like, you can keep that Ponzi scheme going for a long time if you're issuing debt that doesn't, you get paid to do it.
Right. Right. Looks like Uncle John wants to chime in. So, Uncle John.
Hope the French Revolution comment didn't get him too badly.
You're on mute, Uncle John. It's a Zoom for you.
Oh, now I got you. We're
There
back.
we go. You're back on mute.
You
You still got mute.
Uncle John, get Aunt Maria in there.
She's behind the scenes. I still have.
I thought she was your AV person. You're on mute again. All right.
I shouldn't be. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Yes.
Oh, thank God. Okay. Going back to the early, well, I guess it was the early 1980s, Forbes decided to come out with the Forbes 400. Not one billionaire was on the list. Last year, they came out with the Forbes 400. All 400 members were billionaires, and there were 800 people trying to get on the list. I always like to fool around with my students when we talk about the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. If I said, Vinny, you just won $1 million, and I'm going to give you $1 for every second, and eventually in 11 and a half days, you will have your $1 million. And then I said, well, Porter, you were luckier. You won $1 billion, and I'm going to give you $1 for every second. And that takes me 30 and a half years to give Porter his $1 billion. And we have billionaires that have $150 billion. So I think when President Biden talks tonight, he may zero in on this. The other thing I wanted to jump in and talk about is
Uncle John, just to preference, our least favorite billionaire between Ed, Vinny, and myself is Elon Musk. For some reason, we don't like the guy.
I know. And if you look at his current compensation program, the one the board of directors just passed, if he meets certain targets in the next 3 years, his bonus amounts to just about $55 billion.
Yeah.
I don't think he could spend all that money. And there may be some good ways he can use that money. The other thing I wanted to jump in on is that because we've had the Great Recession, and the Great Recession lasted 18 months, that was a long period of time. Unemployment lasted 99 weeks. I mean, it's not like the traditional, 10-month recession that we have here. So these recessions really hurt a little bit. And what I was trying to get into is, and Mike just brought that up, just to add a little flavor to it, is that this certainly never got into the media and so on. But Hank Paulson called the New York Society of Security Analysts, and he asked us if we could put a group of analysts together to fire shots at him because they were going to have the Troubled Asset Relief Program get underway, and that was called TARP, if you remember that. And I think the situation was such, and he's a halfway, I mean, he's a very decent guy, and this didn't get in the media either, but it's public information. His brother was a senior vice president of Lehman. And there was so many things going on at the time. He came to us and he said, we really have to educate an awful lot of people, business people and the public, because he was really afraid, I mean, that the world economy was going to go down and we would have a terrible deflationary spiral. And, if I don't know how much, if you know him or not, but very savvy guy, he was the head of Goldman Sachs. President Bush liked him an awful lot. They both were at the Harvard Business School and so on. And he said, listen, I'm willing to go down in history as the guy that bailed the banks out. We can't afford to have a deflation similar to what we had in 1929. Always, obviously, if we didn't have World War II and the Korean War, it may have taken till the Kennedy administration before the fallout from the Great Depression was fully gone.
We'll never really know.
The other thing I wanted to mention, I've been trying to get on here, as you know. The other thing I want to mention to you is that it's when we broke the back of inflation in 1982. From roughly 1982 to tonight, the gain on the S&P, on the Dow Jones Industrial Average is 3,500+%. So we created a tremendous amount of wealth, but it's only in the hands of a few people. The top 10% of our earnings in the of our wealthy people, they own 80% of the stock. So when we hear all this talk about 401ks, it's very good, but there's not a lot of money in each individual 401k. Only about 51% of the population has a 401k. But it could be a big hit to the market if something goes wrong. And I can tell you what, because of the Great Recession, one thing these folks in Washington fully understand now, as interest rates go up, price earnings multiples come down. And if interest rates get out of hand, you could have a terrible situation. What Hank Paulson was trying to let the world know is that we could have a run on the banks. And if we had a run on the banks, we could see the equity market collapse. We could see the world economy collapse. He was talking about banks failing all around the world. So then we finally got the Dodd-Frank bill. And as Porter has been pointing out, the banks are much, much stronger than they were ever before. And that's the only point I wanted to bring out.
Okay.
And it looks like we got a couple questions in here.
Okay. Yeah, we'll take one from Larry now.
Hi, guys. In today's environment, we've seen a tremendous rise of the shadow banking system, the financial system that's outside the purview of the regulators. There's been an environment of risk on, fueled by low default rates. The Fed is continuing to keep interest rates lower for longer. there's a tremendous amount of liquidity sloshing around looking for yield. Stock prices has risen. In the backdrop of this, we've had some really large surprises. We had the Hutch-Jingos loss. We've had Greensill in Europe on this end of it. I'd like to get your view with these massive losses in credit. Has there been a mindset where there's lack of discipline in the investment world?
Larry, that's a great question. I think you answered it yourself, though. I mean, first of all, it's very hard to underwrite fraud, which Greensill was, right? They had the UK Prime Minister on their board, whatever his name, I forget his name right now, Tony Blair.
Cameron.
Archegos, I would like to see someone go to jail because I think that they misrepresented the truth of what was going on. Do I expect anything to happen? Probably not. One of the things that Vinny and I talk a lot about is that you talk about the gap between rich and poor, good guys, bad guys. The good guy, bad guy thing really pisses me off more is that, the bad guys win more and more. If the SEC in a capitalist society, we like to see, if you play by the rules, you're fine. But if you step outside those rules, a heavy hand comes at you, right? Elon Musk is never allowed to, break securities laws. You're never allowed to run a public company again, or you do stuff like that. The fines are much bigger, but it happens again and again. And sadly, I think this last SEC was pretty much a joke, and everyone's sort of made a joke of it at this point. And so I would like to see, really a lot tougher penalties when you do break those rules. I think that would go a long way to scaring people to, hey, maybe I won't break the rules. But when Elon Musk pays a $30 million fine and makes $200 billion that year, I don't think he cares.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, how weak the regulatory environment is and how the risk reward on fraud is as good as it's ever been. But that's a whole nother discussion.
But to put a period on the end of that sentence, when you look at the Forbes list of all, and I'm not saying all of them, some of them are great entrepreneurs, list of billionaires. If you had price discovery, a lot of them would not be on that list, right? Yeah. And so to me, this is my biggest issue is, the false view of that we have capitalism. We don't. If every time, here's an interesting thing. Take yourself back to March 2020, probably the worst pandemic we've ever seen in this country, right? What is the first response of this government? It wasn't to help the frontline workers. It wasn't to provide capital to restaurants or anyone else who was going out of business. The first thing they did was flood the money of liquidity to ensure that highly levered, unregulated pools of capital don't go under. That's what they did.
They bailed out the hedge funds.
No one wants to talk about it because it's one of these cryptic, we don't know what happened, but that's what happened. And so you want equality, give price discovery. You'll get equality.
Yeah, it's a good point, Vinny. A very good point.
And so, this is, when you see how the sausage is made like we do, it's one of the reasons we're so angry all the time, because there's a lot of bad pieces going in there, right? So.
Yeah, it's what I wanted to ask you guys. First of all, it's The Big Short. You're in the movie. You're around in one of the most famous trades in history, but you guys aren't short sellers. Like, being a permanent short seller is a guaranteed suicide, right? I mean, it's for the people out there who's not familiar with shorting, it is not for the amateur, and even the pros get it wrong more often than not. the risk reward is inverted. You can lose all your money. You can only make 100% in a perfect scenario. It's not what you should be doing on a regular basis, even if you're good at it. However, I know you guys to be deep in the weeds fundamental analysts. I know you guys to be valuation sensitive. And so I was just wondering if you could share with the audience, because you guys allocate capital, you run a firm together, a family office together. How do you guys, with evaluation sensitivity, with fundamental, kind of bona fides, how do you invest in an environment where structurally unprofitable companies get the highest market caps and ExxonMobil, can't get a double-digit multiple? I mean, just take us through how you invest.
It took a lot of maybe sometimes punches to the head,
Right.
to realize that as much as fundamentally you would like to go and short some names, you can't.
Right.
The powers that be, the liquidity, the low interest rate environment just doesn't allow you to do it. More so, and you brought up the great point, we, particularly now, we are constructing a portfolio that's a lot longer than we historically have. And quite frankly, we balance our portfolio in different allocations in different asset classes. We've learned that owning gold, which is effectively short the market in some respects, is
Right.
a better short than shorting Tesla.
Right.
Because you don't really get your face ripped off for no reason. The other thing we do is and Porter will probably address on this, there is a lot of contrarian ideas that you can go out and find, right? They're just not necessarily the things that are discussed on CNBC all day long. In fact, sometimes what's discussed on CNBC as the worst trade is actually where we want to start looking.
Right. Right. No, it's a good point. I mean, there's so many interesting dynamics now in terms of, you guys are in a good position now because you guys are playing the long game. You guys are long-term oriented. You guys embrace the volatility for the positions you believe in, but most people are not wired that way. I think there's a thing that is underestimated as well. It's that, you have a cohort of investors who are baby boomers who are exiting stage right, withdrawing money from the market, and they're being replaced by, I think, a group of investors, millennials largely, similar sized generation, that I think they invest largely on what they like, what they believe in, what they aspire to. So they don't care that Netflix, for instance, may have accounting earnings, but will never generate free cash flow. And they don't care that Tesla will never make money. And they don't care that Uber makes no money and circumvents labor laws. These are things they use, they like, or they aspire to. In the case of Tesla, they aspire to the car. And that's a hard thing to invest against. And on the other hand, from a moral basis, they won't invest in ExxonMobil. They'll never look at a stock like that, So it's some interesting dynamics in terms of money flows and how it flows these days and how that affects equity prices. But I guess that's
there's a lot of questions to unpack there, and
Yeah.
we find ourselves, a lot of times and saying like, I don't know, what do we invest in? These a lot of times doing nothing is good, but I think what it takes is a bit of intellectual flexibility in terms of, being an old school fundamental analyst. If you'd followed that all the way through, you would have been left in the dust, right?
Right.
So I think even a couple of years ago, we were first interested in Bitcoin, and early days, and then there was this one of the big brokerage houses, Mt. Gox, got hacked, and
Right.
thank God we didn't do that, and so went on a pretty big run, came back, collapsed. But I think a lot of the principle of Bitcoin is pretty interesting, right? A finite supply. The blockchains are definitely a very interesting thing. You're going to start to see more fixed income debt issuances on blockchain, and it's a really interesting technology. And so, at that point, we thought it was a decent investment. I wish we'd put our gold allocation to Bitcoin instead, but it's still fine. But now it's more mainstream. It wasn't as mainstream
Right.
back then, but listen, I think it's gonna, there's a question in there. What do I think of Bitcoin? I probably think it's going to go up until the point the government comes out with a heavy hand on it, and that's sort of unmodelable. You know, if I were the government, if I were in charge of Treasury, I certainly wouldn't allow it, because I can issue debt to pay for warships against China. I can't issue Bitcoin to pay for warships, right? And so, you know, it's a huge risk to the U.S. Treasury, I think.
Right.
So would I allow it? No. And you're seeing companies or countries like India, Turkey, you know, ban Bitcoin. So it's kind of a tough one.
Ed, can you hear me now? I'm going to have to jump in because we're running out of time.
Okay.
But I really want to thank you, Eddie, for putting this program together. Thank you, Vinny and Porter. We really learned a lot. We'll probably have to do this one more time. And, you know, when you look at the American capitalistic system, regardless of what asset you go into, you know, if you look at time compounding the American capitalistic system, good investment selection, you normally do pretty well. And I realize Graham and Dodd has gone on vacation for the past several years, but I don't think our economy has. But I wanted to, before I bring in the president of the college, you know, he's a new president, so that's the old story, new men, new methods. But we're still doing what we did many, many years ago. Why I'm so proud of this school and why, you know, teaching, I believe, is the profession that makes all other professions possible. The best job I ever had as a teacher, the psychic income you get when you see the performance of our alumni, and some of them are on this program right here tonight. It beats any W-2 form I've ever gotten, any capital gains I've ever gotten, and so on. It's just mind-boggling. So we want to stay around for another few years. You know, St. Francis has been around since prior to the Civil War. It started in 1859. And we have several missions. You know, one of our missions, of course, is with first-generation college students. We're really pretty good at it. Our goal here, basically, is to get them on the Upward Mobility Express, give them a shot at getting a piece of the American dream, and hopefully they'll give back to society. So we're really, really very good at that. And if anybody can help us, whether it's financial or another means, we can use all the help we can get. But let me bring in the president of the college now. He wants to say a few words, and then I'll wrap it up.
Hey, thanks a lot. So I'll be brief. I mean, again, this was impressive. I really appreciate you guys spending the time that you spent with us. And Vinny Porter, I mean, you know, just powerful stuff. And I really like, I mean, you know, one of the things that I like to say, and you know, this is real. I mean, certainly Vinny the Queens guy, and this isn't a jab at Porter, right? I mean, I think you do yourself with a rower, but I think this is really important that we really begin to think about. I tell this to the young people. I go into about a high school a week, many of the New York City public schools. I go and talk to young people and try to get them a sense of hope, right, for the future. And right now, again, all of you, I acknowledge that there's some challenges going on for the laboring class and the working class in New York City and beyond that. And so I think sometimes it's good just to remind ourselves of that. But the other thing I think, and I'm hopeful in this way, that we will come to see that there is so much talent, right? I like to say, and this isn't new, you know, it's not mine. It's talent's equally distributed. It's just not equally developed. And I think we have so much potential in these spaces, in some spaces where we're not looking to develop the talent. So as you guys think about the work you do, and again, you know, thank you for sharing, Ed and Vinny and Porter, again, thank you for sharing. You know, I also hope you continue to push the story and tell your story in unlikely places, in places like St. Francis College, where folks really, it can resonate, right? Because one of the things they think, and I think this is unfair, right? They think that folks that are at Wall Street, and I think, Ed, I think you said it right, and I think it's true. We partner with a group called SEO. Y'all might know that group. But a lot of our young people, I'm gonna give you just a really quick story. I was in school on the Upper East Side. It's an all-girls school, St. Jean Baptiste. I was talking to the girls, and I was talking to the principal, and I told her, and I was just being honest. I said, you know, when they sent me the address, they gave me the profile of the school, and they sent me the address. I said, they must have given me the wrong address, right? Because you're on the Upper East Side, right? And it's all low-income students. And I arrived, and I said this to her, and I said, you know, I apologize. I mean, you know, you internalize what you would expect in the Upper East Side. And she said, Miguel, what's sad about this is that our young girls don't think that they're allowed to walk around this neighborhood. They come from the Bronx, they come right into the building, and they don't believe that they're allowed to walk in that neighborhood. And the other thing I tell you, so I just hope you help us on this front. The other thing I'll tell you, when I go into high schools in New York City, and I ask folks, have you been down to Wall Street, right? The financial center of the world, they say no. I say, why not? You just get on a train and go to the financial district, right? No, that's not for us. I mean, these are young people in Queens, deep into Brooklyn, right in the Bronx. And so I think we need to dispel that myth. And again, I appreciate you being with us, because I think that myth needs to be dispelled. These young people are talented, they're smart, they're resilient, they're creative. They just don't know what the opportunities are. And they believe, I think mistakenly, that these opportunities aren't for them. So again, just really appreciate your time. I look forward to potential partnering in the future and extending this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Ed, I want to thank you, Eddie, so much for putting this thing together. Certainly very enlightening. And I'd like to tell the audience out there, if you have not seen The Big Short, you really should do it, especially after the session we had tonight. There's comedy involved, there's drama involved, and there's a wonderful message involved as well. So hopefully we'll be able to see you folks again, and we thank you so much for coming on way. And I think we should say goodnight to everybody, and we'll just close right now. Thank you, folks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.